Hey, Jamie here with Dojo Real Estate, and in this video, I'm going to run you through how to do a feasibility analysis for a single family rental. So earlier this week, I was talking with an investor who has a couple properties and is now trying to figure out how to create a system to consistently evaluate the deals in his market. And what I broke down for him over that call was how do you build that system step by step, and what has to come before you actually get to the deal feasibility part. So I'm going to run you through quickly those first 3 points. So one is you need to know your market supply and demand fundamentals. So a lot of people just jump in and they just look at whatever's on Zillow, whatever's on Realtor, whatever's on Redfin, and immediately start jumping into, looking at homes or looking at multifamily, etc. The very first thing you need to do is just, do you want to be in that market in the first place? If you don't know what's going on with supply and demand, you might find a great property, but it's probably going to be at a high price because demand has already been met. Or maybe there's a whole bunch of supply and they're actually building a whole bunch of homes on the other side of town that are all going to be brand new and come in at a price better than what you're buying. So know the supply and demand. That is the first thing. Know your market well. Know the core fundamentals. Second part is know your investment strategy and the buy box criteria. Are you planning on doing renovations, or are you looking for turnkey properties? Are you looking for a density play where you buy a plot with a home and there's extra land so you're able to subdivide it and then build on the other side? Are you looking to do a duplex or a triplex? Like, there's a lot of different strategies that you can do. Do you plan to hold for a while, or are you going to, more or less fix and flip? So know your strategy and your buy box criteria. Your strategy is going to determine the criteria through which you're able to decide how to say no to most of the deals. So you want to come up with what the things are that you're looking for that will help you screen out automatically 80 to 90% of the deals. So the only deals that are left are the ones that are most relevant to the strategy that you're pursuing. Then you get into how do you increase the sourcing of the deals, and that's where you can do automated screening and polls off of the major websites, the MLS, and you can also be building partnerships with wholesalers or other people who are door knocking and doing postcard mailers and cold calling and whatnot. Like, those people are already doing that. You can just buy the business from them. They've earned their fee. So then you need to figure out how are you sourcing all these leads in your market. And then after that, then you get into actually screening for feasibility and determining which of all these deals that are coming down actually make sense for you and where you think reasonably you could hit the minimum return threshold that you've decided for yourself, or if you're syndicating with other investors, for the investors. All right, so I'm going to pull up, as an example, this deal in Savannah. So this is a random house that I found, and the whole purpose of this video is I just want to show you how to look at a house and how to just put numbers to it and decide, does this even make sense moving forward, or do I just kill it where it lies? So this home was listed $240K, and you can see that it was previously sold in 2012 in April for $23,000. So I have a feeling that this might have been land and then they might have built. Then again, that looks like it was too short of a time. 8 months, they probably didn't build. So anyway, a lot has changed in 11 years. So the other important thing here is they listed it initially in September for $274,000. They dropped it to $250, and then they just dropped it again to $240. So that's this property. It's a 3-2, 1173, and you're able to see where it's located here in Savannah. It's right here, just northeast of the downtown area. So this is downtown. You can see it's kind of east here, Pine Gardens area. And again, every market's going to be different. Do I know Savannah inside now? I know it pretty well, but the important thing here is we're putting numbers to it. It's going to be the same process for your market. So before you look at the home, you want to also know the comps. So roughly, I looked at a couple for sale or recently sold comps here, and this should actually be last 6 months because I started digging into some of the Junes. But you're able to see here. So I pulled the date through the date that the property was sold, the address, the number of bedrooms, the number of bathrooms, the square feet for the home. And then I also wanted to know, what did they initially ask? So when they first listed the property, what was their initial list price? And then what did they actually close for? Because what I'm looking at is, what is the spread between asking and final, given the condition of the home, where it's located, the size of the home, etc. Because that's going to give you more context around what's going on in the market. Are buyers and sellers, are buyers able to get, do they have leverage to be able to negotiate down some of their list prices? So then I'm able to see, look at the discounts for these homes that sold. What did they sell as $1 per square foot? I have links, and then if any of them have been rented, so you can see this one was bought in October, and then it was almost immediately listed for rent. And that's because it was a renovated property. It was pretty much turnkey. It was ready to go. And then I usually put notes looking at some of the properties. Are they nice? Are they terrible? Were they fix and flipped, etc. Because again, that gives you context and story around these numbers and why they sold where they sold. And it gives you a better idea of where your property, whatever you're evaluating, should comp to. So you know your market. You've already looked at the comps. You already have a comps list given your investment strategy. And you already have an idea in your head of where the price points are for your 2 beds, your 3 beds, your 4 beds, variation in pricing based on the quality and the condition of the home. So once you have all that, then you can actually start diving into the individual opportunities that you're trying to run feasibility analyses on. Okay, so this property, again, is 2204 Hawthorne Street in Savannah. So for a feasibility analysis, you're going to have different chunks in your investment horizon. So the investment horizon is, let's say you invest in property for 5 years and you plan to sell it at the end of 5 years. That's a 5-year investment horizon. If you hold it for 30 and, or indefinitely, that's an indefinite, it's a perpetual investment horizon. But for modeling, you still have to assume some exit, or unless you're just modeling out the cash flows, in which case you're doing a discounted cash flow. But for this feasibility analysis, again, all we're doing is rough assumptions to determine if it even makes sense for us to do, to even call the broker or to do any more due diligence on the property. So the very first thing, the first part of that investment horizon is your acquisition and investment. So there's going to be cash outflows up front. So the very first thing we have to do is put assumptions to the cash outflows going into the investment. Then what I've put in this example is a 5-year investment horizon where we're operating the property for 5 years, and then we sell the property at the end of the 5th fiscal year of operations. So diving into acquisition cash outflows, due diligence. So when you're evaluating property, you get it under contract, you're going to be spending money, cash out of pocket, on due diligence fees. So you might have a general home inspection, you might have a mainline inspection, you might have a plumbing inspection. If you think that there's probably going to be foundation problems or structural problems, then you might do a structural inspection. So there's cash out of pocket up front during due diligence. So just put an assumption there of $1,000, $1,500, etc. You're going to be spending money. So let's say $1,250 here, and then the acquisition cost. So if this is, let's just say for now, I'm just going to make this flat to what it's listed for. But what you're going to see is this is what we're iterating. This is what we're solving for. What is the maximum offer we can make in order for us to hit our investment returns? So again, we're solving for the purchase price, the maximum offer possible for us to make the offer. Closing costs, if you're working by yourself and you're not using a buy-side broker, then perhaps this is only going to be about 1%. If you are using a buyer broker, maybe it's going to be a little bit higher. So you could put in 3%. I'm going to leave it at 1%. And then acquisition fees, if you are putting deals together for other investors. Now, a single family home, that might not be the case, but I have it in there just in case. So I'm going to leave that at 0 because it's a small deal, it's single family home, and let's assume that this is just one investor. So a renovation budget. Well, if we look at this property, it was in pretty good shape. So we don't know too much about the exterior. I mean, we can maybe look at the roof a little bit. But again, it looks like someone did some work to it just before listing. It doesn't look like it's going to be gutted and have to be completely remodeled, anything like that. So whether you put 5,000, 10,000, there are always surprises. It's never zero. So always put in at least 5,000. Even if you think it's turnkey, just put in 5,000. I like to put in 10,000. Targeted ARV. So ARV is the after repair value. So after you put in the renovation money, usually there's going to be a lift over and above the amount that you invested in the property. At least that's the hope, right? So where this ARV value comes from is your comps. So if you're looking at these comparable properties and you see that, okay, I think the 2402 Alabama, that was a 1.5 bath, and that one sold for $244,000. And then we can see here, 2103 Greenwood was a 2.5, 1246. It sold for $250. This one sold for $235. So maybe we believe after putting some additional money into this property of this $10,000, and depending on where we buy it, we believe that it is going to be worth or could be sold for these comparable prices. But it's going to take a little work to get there. So the ARV is where you believe the value of the property should be after you've put additional renovation money into it. So you can see here I've targeted ARV at 215. So maybe we bump that to, based on these comps, we can see these are all 3 2s. So maybe we bump that to 240. Okay. Now, again, I haven't done, this is just an example, I haven't done a deep dive on this property, this market, or this sub-market. Okay, so value creation, we'll get to this. But the value creation, all right, I'm going to drop that to 200,000 just to be able to show this. So targeted ARV is where do we think the value of the property will be afterwards. How much money we put in. Value creation is the difference between what we believe that ending value is going to be versus how much we purchased it for and then put into it for a renovation budget. So you can see, okay, we created 30 grand of value. That's great. So this 14.3% return on renovation is the G13, which is here, the targeted ARV, which is the new value of the property over the sum of what we initially invested. Again, which is the $210,000 here. We're minusing or subtracting 1. That shows our increased value as a percentage for the deal on just on the renovation. So these are the upfront expenses. So you can see here, these are cash flows for the deal. So you can see due diligence here is $1,250, acquisition is $200, closing fees is $2,000, acquisition fees is $0, renovation budget is pulling here at $10,000, and then CapEx, that's only during the operating period. So those are the upfront cash out of pocket expenses. So now we get into the operating expenses, or the operating period, which is fiscal year 1 through fiscal year 5. And what we're going to do is we're going to build out what that pro forma looks like for the P&L, for the income statement. So we have to start with assumptions for the P&L. So charged rent. How much do we believe rent will be for that property when it goes live? So there's a lot of different sources. You can go on Zillow and look at what our property's renting for. There's a lot of different websites like Rentometer so I just popped in the address here, 2204, 3-bed, 1.5 or more baths, look back 12 months. And then I defined I wanted a minimum square footage for comps of 1,000, 1,300 is a max. And then it builds out a little bell curve here. So you can see the 25th percentile, 75th percentile, what is the median and what's the average. So I prefer to look at the bell curves of the median, 75th and 25th. I don't like average because average is going to incorporate your outliers. So what if there's a property in this area that's actually a mansion, it's gorgeous, or I guess not a mansion, let's say it's 1,200 square feet, so it's within this min-max square feet here. but it's absolutely beautiful, brand new construction, etc. Like that property is not going to be comparable to this property because it's a very different condition, very different vintage. Even though it's a 3-bed and same square footage, it's going to rent very differently. So it's going to be at the higher end. So that average is going to include that. And so you want to be very careful whenever you use an average. You want to focus on the statistical bell curve. So look at the 25th, the 75th, and the median. I have a belief that this property is probably going to be close to the median, if not a little below the median, okay? So I know it's going to be between the 25th and the median. So I have in 2000, so maybe I bumped it up to 2100, so it's between the 25th percentile and the median. Now, we have the vacancy and credit allowance. So the reason you have to bake this in, and a lot of people are very confident and they say, look, I'm going to have 0% vacancy. I market my properties well. I take care of my tenants. I'm going to have 0% vacancy. That's great. It means that you're not going to get financing because the lender's going to look at you and say, you have to include a vacancy cost. You cannot just assume you're going to be perfect and have, zero turnover or zero vacancy. So always include at least a minimum of about 5% because that's what banks are going to be doing anyway. So you want to be underwriting similar to how the lender will be, because if you want to get funding for the deal, you need to be looking through the same pair of glasses. So payment processing, collecting rent, I usually like to put in some payment processing unless you plan to do checks, which at the end of the day, that ends up costing you time or costing someone on your team time. So having, an ACH or wire some way to collect rent digitally is good. You want that. A management fee. So, I want to go back to rent here. So if you were actually going through on the deal, let's say you get it under contract and you're going to proactively go through the due diligence period and really refine your numbers, the way that you would get this even more, a higher confidence interval on this charged rent and what you believe you can do for rent, reach out to 2, 3, or 4 property managers in the area and ask them, what do you believe this property would rent for? Given I'm going to be putting 10 grand in for X, Y, and Z. Then you're going to have 2 or 3 or 4 different inputs from local property managers who know the market very well. And they're going to be able to guide you even more so on where that rent number should be for your model. So now, management fee. As you reach out to them, you can also ask, hey, what's pricing look like? Are you 6% a month? Are you 8% a month of rent, etc.? So I'm going to leave it in at 8%. Leasing commission. So if that property manager is going out and finding tenants for you, typically they're going to have a placement fee or a leasing commission where they're going to take 50% of first month's rent. If they're taking a full month's rent for placing a tenant, I would start looking at other managers or at least be very competitive with them in that negotiation. Everything's negotiable. So property taxes, we can leave that 0.75%. Under a point, and if you know your market well, so let's say that you're only looking in one specific market, you know that market well, what you could do then is then build in a more refined way to project the property taxes. This is a broad blanket feasibility, so I'm going to leave that there. Property insurance, I'm going to leave it about 0.5 point or 0.5%. As a percentage of the after repair value. So it's going to be based on this $240,000 after repair value. So now we have repairs and maintenance as a percentage of gross operating income, which is this line here, gross operating income. So I'm going to leave that at about 5%. And what you're able to see is repairs and maintenance. So that's about $1,200 per year. That makes sense to me. It might be actually a little high depending on the quality of the property. If it's a really great property in great condition, that might be a lot lower. That might be 2% or 3%. So I'm going to leave this one at 5%. Discounts, if you're in a tough environment and you're really struggling to get someone in for a lease, sometimes they offer leasing commissions or leasing discounts or 1 month free or half first month's rent free, or half off, whatever. So you're able to put those discounts in there for the year. Licenses and permits. So if your business is paying any permitting fees or business licensing fees in the area, etc., I'm going to throw in $200 there for the year. Replacement reserves. So similar to depreciation, but the thing is that depreciation is a tax. It's a tax deduction. It's not cash out the door, but that is really an expense for the business. And so a lot of people don't include a replacement reserves in their income statement. And I like to include it in there as a phantom cash flow because eventually that will hit. And if the deal doesn't underwrite and the deal doesn't hit my feasibility metrics, even including that, it's definitely a no-go. But if it's just barely scraping by, not including that cash flow, the moment I do have a problem hit, then that's going to be a big problem. So there will be CapEx expenditures in the future. There will be those capital requirements for the property. So you want to include in an annual expense there to give yourself a little bit of a buffer. It's almost like a little contingency. So then you have legal. You're going to have some legal expenses. I'm throwing in $250 a year, accounting, $300 per year, advertising. Well, if I'm paying this manager 8% to manage it and then 50% of the first month's rent to put a tenant in there, I would really hope that I'm not paying for advertising because that's what I'm paying them for. So lawn and snow, you can see it was a pretty small lot. It definitely needs some work here in the front. It's not the most lovely property. But assume that there's grass there. Someone's going to have to cut that and maybe some flowers here or whatnot. So someone's going to have to take care of the property. So maybe that's $75 a month. Maybe it's $100. Pest control, let's put that at $30 a month. Utilities, tenant is going to be paying utilities in this case, or at least I'm assuming that. So that's going to be $0. HOA, there's no HOA. Let me just double check that is true. So usually in here, if there's an HOA, they will include it down in the description. Yeah, so I'm not seeing HOA anywhere in here. So yeah, you can see this property was built in 1950. Zoning, R6, interesting. So that means maybe there's a density, but it looks like a pretty small parcel. So cool, so I'm gonna keep HOA at $0 and then other expense. So if you want to include in any other expenses for the deal, etc., you can put that in there. These I have as monthly, and then these I have as a per year. Now, all of these, you might not know with absolute certainty what these are going to be. That's okay. As long as you're within ballpark. So call it 80-90% confidence in the numbers that you're putting in here, and never be afraid to just shoot out emails, start messaging people, call people locally. If you're unsure about utilities, well, you can call the water company and just say, hey, I'm trying to estimate roughly what I think this home or a home in this area with 3 beds would probably be per month. Well, guess what? They can probably provide some estimate or some insight there. So you can always reach out to people about any of these expenses just by doing a quick Google search, sending a couple emails or picking up the phone and just having a quick 3 to 5 minute call. This is not hard. It just takes a little bit of time. So then your capital expenditures. So the capital expenditures are there's going to be work in order to improve the property per year. Again, this is just going to be a reserve or an assumption to give you some cushion in case something happens. So let's say CapEx, I'm going to leave that at about 3% per year of NOI, which is your net operating income. And so really this reserve means that if the cash is coming in from the property and the very first thing you're going to have to do is pay all of your expenses, you get the net operating income, that goes into the checking account of the property. Well then, as it goes into the checking account, you're then going to have to pay out to the mortgage to meet your debt service. But then ideally what you want is a savings account. And that savings account is going to be a capital reserve, because you're putting money in there as a rainy day fund for whenever something hits the fan for the property later on. You're not having to dip into the checking account or your own pocket if there's not enough in the checking account in order to service the property. So this is a reserve that's going into a savings account for the property. It's separate. you're earning whatever the money market returns are for that. It might be 3%, 2%, 4%, 5%, etc. And then operating reserve. You can also have an operating reserve. So that, I'm just going to put that 0. So these are all of your operating cash flows. So now we can build that out. So we have the gross potential rent, which is the $2,100 per month. Multiply that by 12, and that gets us to $25,200 for fiscal year 1. Well, now you can see if we're going to assume future years, well, then we're going to have to grow both the expenses and the rent over that time. Or we're going to have to take a view on what's going to happen over that period of time. Well, annual rent increase. So I have 0% for fiscal year 2. Why? Well, I think it's going to be softening. I think that especially where interest rates are, I think that there's going to be a softening in the economy. But then again, some other people might say, hey, because there's high interest rates, not a lot of people can buy homes. There's going to be more people who can't afford their debt payments. They're going to have to move out and move into a rental. So I think rental demand is going to increase. So you can take whatever view you want on these. What I encourage you is do not make these too optimistic, and then your deal becomes dependent on rent growth. You don't want that. So 0% for year 1, 1.5% for fiscal year 3, 2% for year 4, 2% for year 5. I mean, I think that's realistic. I think it's pretty conservative. And then annual expense increase, 1.5%. You can make that 2%. You can make that whatever you want. Let's just keep it at 2%. Because that's the Fed mandated, inflation target, or 2%. So then now we have the gross rent. We're growing that $25,000, and we're doing 1 plus that rent increase, and we're just building that out over the years and increasing it. So then vacancy and credit allowance. Well, this is going to be a percentage of your rent. So we're building that out. Payment processing, and then our gross operating income. How much have we actually collected after the payment processing, and then after our uncollectible or vacancy cost? So then we actually go through and build out all the expenses. So management, leasing commissions, taxes, all the way down. And that gets us to our total expenses. And then we have our net operating income, which is our gross operating income less our total expenses. And then we're able to look at the margin. So what percentage is NOI of our total gross potential rent? And we can see here, okay, 56% margin, 55, 55, 55 flat. Okay, so now what we need to assume is the exit, or let's assume we sell the property in year 5. How do we think through that? Well, again, that's going to be based on some of our comps, and it's also just our view on the market. So this is 235, but I think that's a little low. So if we said our targeted ARV is 240 now, then maybe we believe that this might get to 255 or 260. And what I have here is the implied 5-year compounded annual growth rate from the after repair value. So the reason I care about that number is because I want to know what this exit price is implying as an annual growth rate in the property value. If you've got someone who's baking in, a 30% or 10% or 15% year-over-year growth in the property value from their after repair value, that's just unrealistic most of the time, unless you found some treasure trove market. So you would not want to bet your investment success on a seemingly unrealistic growth rate for the property value. So it's very important that you're always thinking about what is the implied growth rate for the property based on a certain exit price. So then you have your closing fees. So you're going to be paying, as the seller, you're going to be paying both the sell side broker and the buy side broker. So maybe you keep that at 6%, maybe 7%. A purchase price, okay. So now what we're doing is we're looking at how do you calculate the adjusted basis of the property for what would be your tax basis when you actually sell the property. So we know that we bought it for $200,000. We put $10,000 into the property for renovations. Our closing fees when we sell the property is $18,200. Again, that's going to benefit us in increasing the lift on our basis. And then we have depreciation, which we have to deduct out of the basis because we've already taken tax advantages because of that depreciation. So that gets us our adjusted property basis. And then we have our taxable gain on sale. So what would be taxable if we sold this property 5 years from now at that price, given our entry purchase price point? Cool. So now you can see where that ties in. So our exit sales price here is $260K. Our closing fees are those. And then our net proceeds pre-tax. So we're not even looking at taxes here for the feasibility. Our pre-tax net proceeds is about $242,000. So now we want to look at the unlevered cash flows for the deal, as well as the levered cash flows and the financing assumptions for the deal. But before you ever look at a deal on a financed basis, just look at the deal as is. Would you, if you had all the cash in the world and you had, many different investment options to place that money, would you buy this deal all cash? Does it even make sense all cash? Because if it doesn't make sense all cash, it probably is not going to make sense leveraged. Because by adding leverage to the deal, you're increasing the risk of the deal. So if it's already a bad deal all cash, it's probably higher risk and probably a worse deal that you're forcing to make work by adding debt to the deal. And you're looking at this levered IRR and this levered return and this levered cash on cash return. But what a lot of investors fail to take into account is the risk, that you've increased the risk of the investment. And so because of that, you need to think about, do I believe in the business plan? Do I believe in the cash flows? What happens if cash flows dip 10, 15, 20% for 1 year? Am I going to break all my debt covenants and then all of a sudden I lose the property and all my initial investment in the cash flows? That'd be a pretty terrible situation. So if the deal is a bad deal, unlevered, without any financing, that should be your first red flag. So unlevered cash flows. So how we're going to calculate this is we're going to take for each period. So this is the acquisition and the investment period. So this is a non-operating period right now. We're going to take the total upfront cash outflows here. We're going to add any NOI, which again, this is non-operating, so there's zero here, plus any exit net proceeds, which is zero here as well. And then we're going to drag that formula across here, and you can see that we have $13,741 because we're going to have a little bit of CapEx outflow here, $425. That's the reserve. And then we have our NOI, we're adding those together, and then that's getting us the $13,741. We're then dragging that over for the years. You can see that it's slightly increasing. It decreased here because you can see we had 0% rent increase, but we had our expenses increased by 2%. So that's why this margin falls a little bit and why this unlevered cash flow falls a little bit. But then you can see it jumps again as soon as we put in a little bit of rent increase, 1.5%. It increases, and then the exit 256, and that's because it's including the net proceeds. So those are the cash flows for the deal. So our cost basis, when we're looking at the yield on cost, and we want to know how is this property performing on a yield on cost basis, how we can define that is the cost basis is the purchase price plus capital expenditures. So the cost basis for the property itself is your purchase price and the capital expenditure, or the budget, the investment into the fixed property itself up front. So that we know is our $200,000 plus the $10,000 plus the CapEx that we're setting aside and assuming we're going to have to put that into the property someday. So I added those up. I called that the cost basis. And now what I want to look at is what is the net operating income based on that cost basis. And then that's going to be our yield on cost. So we put that out for each year, and you can see that that's going to be slowly growing. And that's because this cost basis stays fixed whereas your net operating income is slowly growing year over year. So that's the reason why there's a trending slight increase on that yield on cost. Then you have your average yield on cost, which is just averaging them, and your unlevered IRR. So for the IRR formula, you're just selecting these series of cash flows, and then that's going to tell you what this internal rate of return is for the deal. So if you're unfamiliar with internal rate of return, it is the discount rate at which you could discount all of the cash flows for a net present value of 0. If you're not exactly sure what that means, I encourage you do a YouTube video and understand the relationship between your internal rate of return and your net present value, because you need to, and your cost of capital. You need to understand the relationship between those three key variables. So now we can look at the financing cash flows. So debt borrowed. So let's go up here. Let's look at the financing assumptions that I have in here. So LTV, which is loan to value percentage, we're just going to assume that it was an acquisition loan. There's no renovation loan or anything like that. It's just a simple acquisition loan for the value of the property. So we're going to say 60% loan to value. The rate is 8%. The term is 30 years. Loan points is 1.5% upfront for mortgage underwriting. And then you can see here calculated monthly debt service payment for this loan. In terms of loan to value at 60%, most investors see that and immediately go, oh my God, I usually do 80%. I do 20% down. Well, in a very high interest rate environment, there's a lot of people that are only looking to do maximum leverage deals, but then the problem is their interest rate is so high that all their cash flows are negative. Their levered cash flows are negative because their debt service payments are so high. The other problem there is you're exposing yourself to even greater risk. If you look at why did so many properties go underwater during 2008, 2009, it's because they were over levered, cash flows dried up, they couldn't refinance or restructure their debt, and they couldn't meet their debt service payments. So, I don't want to say that that's exactly where we're headed, but it might be. And I've already seen other investors start to lose their deals because they're over levered. They had floating rate notes, interest rates increased, they were short-term rentals, and their short-term rentals dipped for a period of about 2 quarters. And all of a sudden, those cash flows dried up, significantly more so than they were expecting. They started breaking debt covenants. They had to short sale the properties. So this is, in a high interest rate environment, you want to be careful with how much debt you're loading on a property because it increases the total deal risk, even though that risk isn't quantified in the model. So always keep that in mind. So now if we come down here, so we made those loan assumptions. So now we get down here and we can see debt borrowed $120,000. Well, that's the LTV, the 60% multiplied by this $200,000 here, the purchase price. Our loan points, which was the 1.5% upfront on our loan proceeds, which is the $120,000. And then we have our debt service payment. So that's going to stay fixed over time. This is assuming a fixed interest rate loan over 30 years. So 30 years amortizing, 30 years interest. And so we're just taking this monthly debt service of $881. We're multiplying that by 12. So that gets us our debt service payment outflows, our debt repayment. So what I did here is I just built out a very simple mortgage table or amortization table. So you're able to see here the periods, which are months. We start a loan at $120,000. Our interest payment, you can use the IPMT function. You do your 8% rate divided by 12 because it's monthly. And then you're doing that for the first period. Your AC7, which is your term, 30 years, you have to multiply that by 12 for monthly. And then your beginning balance. And we're going to keep it fixed on this $120,000 proceed loan. So then we build out our interest, exact same for payment, except we're looking at principal repayments. You can use the PPMT formula. We build that out, and then our ending balance. And then we can just drag and drop that all the way down to period 60. And so what we're able to get to here for period 60 is if we sell this property at the end of 5 years, which is going to be period 60, then we're still going to have to repay $114,000 on the loan. So that is going to be the debt repayment that we're linking this to. And so you can see it's linked there. Cool. So now we have a debt repayment. And then levered cash flows. We can take our unlevered cash flows and then sum with the financing cash flows here for each period. And you can see, okay, so now our levered cash flows are a lot less up front because we're borrowing 120 grand up front. And then our levered cash flows each year are going to be lower because we have the debt service payments. And then ultimately this exit cash flow is going to be a lot lower because we have to repay the debt at the end. Now you can see the levered internal rate of return 9.2% is slightly higher than the unlevered. Again, that's because that's the effect of leverage. And that also tells me that it means that the debt is positively affecting us for the deal. So it's a positive leverage deal, slightly, very, very slightly. That's a good thing. If it's a negative, if you're destroying value in the deal, if your cost of capital, an example here, if your cost of capital is 10%, but your deal is only returning 8%, you're destroying value because you have to hit 10% because that's the cost of your capital. And if it's only returning 8%, that's like it's like putting in $1 and only getting 98 cents back. So you're losing that 2%. So if you have a deal that is destroying value and you add debt to that deal, you leverage that deal, what you're doing is you're accelerating the destruction of value for your equity that you put in the deal. So if you ever have a situation where your unlevered IRR is higher than your levered IRR, that means that you have a negatively leveraged or a negative leverage affecting deal. And that's not a good thing. It means you're destroying value and you're accelerating it with that. So now we have our equity basis, which we're looking at our total cost basis here, or total cash up front here, because this is all the cash that has to be outlaid up front. And then once we assume that, okay, there's going to be these additional cash flows for the financing, anything that was not paid for with debt, we're assuming that we paid for with equity. So that's going to be our equity basis up front. And then we can look at the cash on cash, which is looking at our annual levered cash flows, our annual levered operating cash flows over that equity basis. So all we're doing here is we're looking at the levered cash flows each year. So we're going to have the NOI each year, and then we're going to have that small little CapEx reserve. So we're taking that out, and then we have to pay the mortgage or pay the debt service. Whatever's left is going to be that levered cash flow for the year, and then we're taking that over the equity basis. That's how we're calculating cash on cash here. And then you can see it's the very similar trend here as the yield on cost. It's increasing slightly with a dip in the second year because we're flatting rent at 0% growth for the year 2. So then we can take the average of the cash on cash, and then our levered IRR is we're using these series of levered cash flows to calculate that. Cool. So now if we were to look at this summary of the deal, we can see that let's assume our cost of equity is 9%. The long-term pre-tax return of the S&P 500 over the history of the S&P 500 is like pretty much 9 to 10% pre-tax. Okay, so let's assume that 9% is going to be our cost of equity then. Well, we can see our unlevered IRR is just below that. And then we have our average yield on cost of about 6.8%, so that's the cash yield. Our levered IRR, or our levered return for the deal, is 9.2%. The cash on cash is about 3.5%. So the reason I like stacking these directly next to each other is because you're looking at two types of returns. This first return, IRR, internal rate of return, is taking into account the property value and the appreciation of the property over the hold period. So over the 5 years, we're going to sell it in the future. We're going to make money, and it also takes into account that we're paying down the debt, the principal on the loan over that 5 years. So that's taking into account the equity build and the actual value of the property. Now, if you look at just the cash yields, so the unlevered cash yield here, which is the yield on cost, that's just looking at the cash, the annual cash flows over the amount that was invested in the property, or the cost basis of the property. So very similar here for the levered, what we want to look at is the levered total value of the deal and the levered cash returns for the deal. Some people only look at deals based on cash returns. And they say, look, I won't look at anything with a cash on cash less than 5% or less than 7%. Some people say, look, if I'm going to put a money in a deal, I really don't care about the cash flow. But if we sell it in 3 to 5 years and we make a 15% return, and that return is defined by the internal rate of return or the IRR, let's do it. Like, heck, if I have to put in $1,000 every month, I'll do it if we're going to make 15%. Because some deals actually are negative cash flowing very slightly each month. But when you sell 3, 5, 7 years later, you're going to make a killing because of the value appreciation of the market, the property, etc. So you want to always look at both returns, both types of returns for both the unlevered structure of the deal as well as the leverage structure of the deal. So now we can look at the offer. So now we're getting into how do we know what to offer for the property. So if we know that we're going to be doing let's say our target is a 10% unlevered internal rate of return or a 10% levered. Well, what we can do is we can do a goal seek for this sell, and we can set it for 10% by changing the purchase price here. And so by doing that, it's going to iterate. And you can see, okay, now our levered return is 10%. And that's saying that, okay, the maximum that we're able to pay for this property is $197,000. So I'm going to change that there. You can see it's still, all right, very slightly. I bumped that out. It's 9.95. Let's call that 10. So $197,000. So if our requirement internally as an investor for this property was we have to hit a 10% levered IRR or no deal, well then we goal seek for 10% and we know that the maximum we can pay for the property with these assumptions for the entire deal is about $197,000. Now, let's say that our unlevered IRR, we were okay with a 8% return there. So we would set that to 0.08 by changing sell purchase price here. Okay, $206,000. That's the maximum. So if your savings account right now is earning 4%, just given where interest rates are right now, and today's October 19th, 2023, interest rates in a savings account, people are earning like 4.4% if you're at Marcus or Goldman or Ally Bank or any of the others. So if you're earning that on your savings account, and if you're able to invest in a U.S. government bond, I think, I don't know where 10 years are or 30 years are, but you have very safe, secure government securities that if you were to invest in that bond and call it 5 or 6%, well, is 8% really attractive? Because you're taking a lot more risk with this deal than just putting it in a government bond and getting 5 or 6%. So maybe this 8% is too low. Maybe you're saying, look, I have to get at least a 10% return on my money for me to go through all the hassle, all the headache, and everything that has to go in to be able to make this deal happen, and have to deal with tenants and project manage the property manager and anyone else included. So now you iterate that and say, okay, about $189,000 now is about your, or I guess right around $190,000 is your maximum offer that you can pay for the property. So what I want you to see here is based on whatever your requirements are personally as an investor, what would make you feel comfortable with the return for the deal, you're iterating and solving for the returns, and the variable you're iterating through is your purchase price. That's the maximum offer for the deal. And that's how you determine whether or not the deal is feasible. Because now if we look at this property and we say, okay, it was listed for $240 or about $205 per square foot. Our maximum offer is $109,000, and we're implying a discount to list of about 21%. Well, has anyone even come close to that in the market? Well, I can see here, I mean, these people got a 16%, 12%, 11%. Look, it might be a total shot in the dark, but why not take the shot? The worst thing they can do is say no. So this is an example where you know your price as an investor. So you can approach them and say, I'm an investor. I'm underwriting for very specific return metrics. the best offer I can make you is $190,000. I'm aware that you might be getting better offers from other buyers. However, if they're looking to purchase a property, you as a seller, you're going to have a lot more risk working with someone who's looking for a home to live in, because there's a lot of things that they're looking for personally that, color, style, maybe their loans fall through. I'm an investor. I have access to my capital. I'm serious. I know I will buy this deal at this price if you're willing to, and I'm going to close. So you're able to have more conviction in your ability to close as an investor when you know your number. You explain to them how you approach this number. And the other thing too is if they have other offers, they're probably going to go with them anyways. So a lot of people are afraid to lowball. Lowball is only bad when you're not explaining why you're showing and delivering the number that you are. If they understand you're an investor and they understand how, you don't have to show them your underwrite, but just say, look, I've underwritten the property. I know my returns. This is the maximum offer. Take it or leave it. They're not going to be mad at you. And you cannot be afraid of someone being mad at you for lowballing. You're an investor. The numbers are the numbers. So now, this last part here is just property info to keep in the back of your head as you're looking at the home. So I'm going to pull this back up again. So next time you're looking at any home and you're trying to decide whether or not a deal is worth your time or not, you need to start at the very top of the funnel. So start with your market supply and demand. Do you like the market in the first place? And do you believe that the fundamentals for that market are going to stay strong for the next 5 to 10 years? Then you want to know your strategy and your buy box criteria. Lastly is you need to know your cost of capital and the minimum return criteria that you're willing to accept for a deal. And only then do you start sourcing and screening deals with a model like this for feasibility. So I hope this was super helpful. I know that this video ended up being a lot longer than I thought it would be. But again, my name is Jamie Carlstedt. I'm the founding principal of Dojo Real Estate. I work very closely with both commercial investors, larger investors. I work with individual investors of all different sizes. So, I can help you underwrite single family homes, multifamilies, much larger deals. What I encourage you to do is check out my LinkedIn profile, or you can just go to dojorealestate.com. That'll take you right over to my LinkedIn profile. You can see what I'm up to, how I'm working with people. And if you found this helpful, I'm also doing more or less kind of coaching, consulting, like working with investors once a month or twice a month, where we just meet to talk through your business strategy. How are you finding your deals? How do you move through the different steps of the process? How do you build a portfolio? How do you talk to lenders? How do you show them the deals that you're underwriting in order to get the loans that you need to close on these deals? How do you work with other investors in order to source more equity in order to do more deals? Because this is the other thing that stops a lot of people from growing their portfolios is they see the purchase price and they see the amount that they need to put down in equity, and they limit their growth to the amount of equity that they personally or their family has. By understanding that the purpose of underwriting deals and finding good deals is that's the game. Find a great deal, the money will come. You can talk to investors, you can talk to lenders. If you have a great deal and because you've talked to other investors and you're able to source the equity to do a lower loan to value percentage, the lenders are going to want to work with you. Because the moment you don't need all of their money, they want to give you more because it's a lower risk deal. The risk of you defaulting on a 60% loan to value deal as compared to an 80% loan to value deal is a lot lower. And so you're a lot more likely to actually get the funding for the deal. So know your numbers, know how to put it all together. I work with people to do that, and I kind of guide them and consult them through. And I also do individual underwriting for a fee, underwriting as a service. So that's what I'm about. You can catch me on LinkedIn, Jamie Carlstedt, dojorealestate.com. Thanks, and I'll see you in the next one.